This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London. All of our podcasts are available from our website, www.sas.ac.uk.
And one of the examples, this is one of the sample erasures that's on the website called Raw Reason by one of the users. Another one called Handling Enough Poem, just doing some other. There's about 170 using CAD on the website. So they all work on the same premise. They use the short fragment that's available. They remove bits of the text, keep part of it on the page in exactly the same place where it was in the original, and create new text that way. So these are a couple of examples. And today I will be talking about erasure poetry and texts that are created exactly this particular way. But we'll be focusing on two texts, Phillips' Song and Travis McDonald's Submission Repo. And Zong is the text, they both published in 2008, so they're both quite recent texts. And Zong is a text that uses as a source text a 500-word case report of Gregson's versus Gilbert. And this is the case that's more famously known as the Zong case. And this is kind of historically one of the most formative trials in the abolitionist movement against slavery and slave trade. And it involves around a massacre on board of a ship called Zong that happened in 1781 when around 150 slaves were killed, but purely for insurance reasons. So it's just a 500-word document that she's using to create the erasure in Zong. And Omission Repo erases another document, and McDonald uses the 9/11 Commission report that's documenting the kind of events leading to the 9/11 attacks on World Trade Center, and tries to draw and create the background to what happened and then draw some conclusions. So these are the two source texts for these. And both of them use a number of different erasure procedures. Zong plays with erasure, trying to black out text, white out text, mutilate, cut and paste, to create a collection of poems as a result. And it's divided into 7 parts, and each part uses a slightly different technique. And only the first section really uses erasure in the same way that the Wave Books website does. So this is a sample of the first section. So it's keeping the original topography of the page, erasing part of the text and leaving blank pages. In further section, Philip is using what she describes as a breaking and entering method of textual appropriation. So she uses the source as a kind of lexical repository, and in the process of the kind of rereading and rewriting the report she's engaging in, she created dictionaries of the new words she could derive from the report, and then she subsequently uses them to create further sections of Zong. So the sections beyond the first one are slightly different take on erasure as a creative practice. So when she's in one of the interviews with her that are available online, she's commented on the material and said that her intention was to use the report as a word store. Where the legal text she uses parallels, she stresses a certain kind of entity, a whole or a completeness, which in the process of appropriation is rent and torn, working against meaning, working for meaning, working in and out of meaning. So this is the example. The first section, as I mentioned, for instance, one of the further sections adds much more text and uses words that are not necessarily there in the report. They're recreated and derived from the text. And then, for instance, the final section, it's not very well visible here, but it's also not very well visible in the book. It's trying to play with the idea of kind of multi-vocal narrative that would have been created on board of the ship with a mixture of different languages as well. And in the book, it's also grayed out, and there are layers of text upon layers of text that make it completely illegible. So just like Zong, Omission's using different erasure techniques. The book I'm working on, and it's currently the only one available, is the first volume of Omission Repo, but there's meant to be a second one coming out sometime soon. And the first book is composed out of an erasure of the preface and the first 4 chapters of the 9/11 report, and each section is erased using a different technique. And McDonald was saying that in quite a few interviews that he's given, he's saying that his initial intention was to to just black out parts of the text to create this kind of illusion of a censored document. And in a way he's doing this, he's really echoing Jen Holter's redactive painting. I don't know if any of you have seen these. This was on my first slide, one of them. So this is Jen Holter's one of the redaction paintings where she's playing and working with, it was a whole collection of those, when she's working with the classified governmental documents, and they just reprint it. So that's what, a similar thing is happening in McDonald's, one of McDonald's section, but he was going to do that for the entire book. He's now doing it only in the preface. So this is the first page of the preface he's erasing. Further sections use different erasure techniques, and he's saying that he's using those different techniques to mirror what actually happens in the report itself. So the form of the omission report is meant to mirror the events that are described in the 9/11 report. So this is the preface, this is the first chapter, so he's just striking out the text, but you can see a layer of the text underneath it. The third section, again, it's not very well legible here, but again, that's what happens in a book. You've got a greyed out text in the background that you can't really read very well, and then you've got bits of the text that remain in black. There is another section that's just erased, like the Wave Book poetry website does, leaving page on the text on a page. And the final section in this first volume is inscribed into a musical score. And there are connections to the content of the text, but the primary way he's engaging with this form content trajectory is to play with individual words and taking them out of context and then using them in a different way. So for instance, in the report there is a lot of discussion about a score in terms of numbers, and he takes it out of the context and plays with a musical score to inscribe his text onto the score in the process. But these two texts are in no way only examples of erasure poetry now, and erasure as a method and creative method seems to be gaining a particular momentum on the contemporary literary scene. I'm not talking about the avant-garde, small press circles, but nevertheless within this environment there seems to be quite a marked proliferation of writing by erasure. So I'll show you a few examples. This is, for instance, A Little White Shadow. It's Mary Ruefle's book from 2006, and she does a lot of erasures like that when she's using Tipex to remove parts of the text and then retains it like that on the page. This is Jen Bervin's Nets. It was published in 2004, and it's using Shakespeare's sonnets, and the way she's working is to retain, again, the kind of greyed out text in the background and just keep a few words that she wanted to focus on in black on the page. Then this is Janet Holmes's The MS of My Kin, which is erasing poems of Emily Dickinson, and it was published in 2009. This is just another example, Yeda Morrison's Darkness, and this book erases the first chapter of Conrad's Heart of Darkness, but it's trying to erase all the references to nature from the text. This is something that lots of you might have seen before. This is Tree of Codes, Stephen Fro's Tree of Codes, that's cutting out a different novel, Street of Crocodiles. And this is very handily erased in a way that links to the theme of erasure as such and the talk as such. But this is Austin Kleon's newspaper Blackout that was published in 2011. Kleon is a very marked presence online, and he has a very successful blog where you can add your own erasures, but his method is to use newspapers and a marker pen, and then he scans those and puts them online, and has a book of these out now. So the practices all these authors engage in are not exactly new, and all the authors that I showed, of whose work I've showed you, and quite a few others that are out there, they all very eagerly reference John Phillips' Humament, and they also refer to Ronald Johnson's radios as their core influence. And most of you are probably familiar with either one or the other or both, but I will also show them, particularly because they're quite stunning to look at. So Humament is now, that will be discussed extensively in July, but it's now in its 5th edition, and this is the cover of the 5th edition. This is just a sample page, and for those of you who are not familiar, it's a treated document, as Philip describes it. It's using William Mallock's The Human Document, quite an obscure text he found, and it paints over the pages to create a narrative, and retains some of the page to create a narrative. And Ronald Johnson's Radios, this is an erasure of Paradise Lost, one of Milton's editions of Paradise Lost, but his attitude and approach to erasure is much more on the minimalist side, and he's doing the kind of way that you've already seen, the kind of method you've already seen, when he's just retaining some words on a page, but in the same layout as they were in the original text. They both also came out at a very similar time. The first edition of The Human came out in 1973. This is the kind of exhibition edition because it was sort of originally exhibited. And Radios came out in 1977. So they're all coming out at the same cultural moment. So what all these texts, both the 1970s erasures, or historical erasures, and the contemporary ones do is to create new texts out of old. But in the process they engage with both the source text and the kind of peculiar hyperbolic intertext. So it's a strategy of both reading and writing. The paragrammatic take on textuality that's inherent in erasure writing challenges characteristically the normative referentiality of language. And by approaching a page of a source text as a platform for compositional creative practice, all the authors I mentioned, to various degrees, erase or overwrite the original, obscuring the text, rendering most of it illegible, and at the same time pouring new meanings into the refrained remaining fragments while engineering novel linguistic relationships built out of the pre-inscribed syntactic structures that the host texts impose. So with their treatments of their respective source texts, Johnson, Phillips, Morrison and all the others, engage in a process of simultaneously rewriting and misreading. And misreading is Hassan's term. So while acknowledging and at the same time repudiating the source, the authors that engage with the erasure practice produce the kind of difference out of sameness and presence out of absence at the same time. And it's both in the kind of physical, typographical terms and through the approach to questions of authorship and proprietary nature of text. So their writing can be said to operate sous rauture under erasure, and I borrow the term in my approach to kind of theorizing erasure as a genre from Spivak's translation of Derrida's term in of grammatology. That's something that's a running theme in my theory of erasure. So in a way, erasure becomes a creative form of expression that explores both literary tradition of excess and minimalism at the same time, and in a kind of paradoxical way reconciles both. It's removing and supplementing text and meaning simultaneously. And I've got a quote from McDonald when he's commenting on his own practice. My own role as a poet in this process has closely resembled that of an archaeologist, much more than that of an architect. After all, the subtraction of text is at its core a sculptural act of which the goal is to reveal rather than to impose upon the page. So there's this kind of very key debate about the aesthetic interplay of modernist formalism and postmodernist subversion that kind of echoes quite prominently in Erasure's writing, and I believe it's quite important for discussing the work of authors I've mentioned, but especially about Johnson, when we think about Johnson and Philip in relation to their status within this particular cultural moment when the works were created. I don't really have much time to mention it, so for the sake of today's paper, I'll just say that I would like to argue that Johnson and Phillips and their work didn't really reside very comfortably within the cultural frame of their own time. And the kind of very scant available body of criticism seems to kind of confirm that idea. And the particular renaissance of erasure today also seems to work in that context. And I'd like to suggest, having said that the developments that are happening now in erasure have something to do with the current cultural climate of the kind of new media ecology, and erasure seems to be finding much more fertile ground and more appropriated creative environment of the kind of contemporary age of digital reproduction than the 1970s were for erasure as a practice. So erasure writing, when considered within the frame of the current new media ecology, turns into some kind of expression of contemporary copy-paste culture, in a way, with uncreative, unoriginal poetics of plagiarism that's turning gradually into paradigm for the current condition of writing. That's not exactly the case in all cases, but there's this underlying idea that that the contemporary culture triggers particular developments in creativity. There is this overt propensity for the poetics of creative recycling that the contemporary authors exhibit, and it reflects, as Goldsmith and Working as a kind of propagators of those developments argue, the inherent dynamics of the discursive nature of era of information technology, governed by the oscillation of copy-paste gestures, fluidity of information dissemination, instantaneous nature of reproduction, and ambiguous status of authorship and textual ownership, the modes of textual production online influence. And I'm quoting Sean Bishop now, who is an Erasure author himself, though none of his Erasures saw the light of day yet. He's kind of there online. And Bishop says, the form speaks directly to the moment in which we live. Every day we are overwhelmed with information and we have to exert that information to make a story. Complete and unchallenged narratives are almost never given to us anymore, or rather, we are less and less inclined to accept them. The kind of avant-garde experiments that Johnson and Philip instigated in the 1970s, together with the literary developments such as concrete poetry, found poetry, and literary appropriation in general, seem to have found a more adequate cultural moment today. I would like to introduce another quote, and this is from Kenneth Goldsmith when he's commenting on kind of contemporary rediscovery of concretism in poetry. Goldsmith says, like de Kooning's famous statement, history doesn't influence me, I influence it. It's taken the web to make us see how pressing concrete poetics was in predicting its own lively reception half a century later. What has been missing from concrete poetry was an appropriate environment in which it could flourish. For many years, concrete poetry has been in limbo, it's been a displaced genre in search of a new medium, and now it found one. So the 21st century interest in Erasure seems to reverberate quite clearly with the same cultural historical dynamics Goldsmith describes. Today, the nature of Erasure, and specifically an appropriation kind of much more broadly, requires a particular reconceptualization of the practice to include the proclivity of the current cultural moment. And my reading of the 21st century creativity by Erasure is very much driven by that kind of approach as an underlying framework. Ron Silliman, I don't know if any of you have ever seen Ron Silliman's blog, but he's been recently raising questions of value and innovation that's embedded in writing by Erasure as it kind of proliferates at present, asking whether contemporary reappropriation of the technique carry forward, and this is a quote from Silliman, in the same innovative spirit as the works that initiated them, or perhaps represent something different. So kind of questions of reverence and of an exigency for, as Silliman rather dismissively puts it, an erased edition of every major work of English language aside. I'd like to suggest that the latter is in fact the case. And I've got a quote from Working, who's written quite extensively what he talks about as forms of illegibility, and Erasure, according for him, is one. Even identical modes of illegibility produce a wide variety of unique local effects. The formal elements of a text signify in specific politically and historically inflected ways. Form must always necessarily signify, but any particular signification historical contingent and never inherently meaningful a priori. So if the foundations of the current cultural moment of the kind of late age of print, and this is David Bolter's term to describe what's going on today, these reside in the transition of discursive practices from the printing press to hypertextuality, that these also affect the development of contemporary subjectivity beyond the immediate confines of the sphere of the World Wide Web. And this is another quote, and this one is from Phillips and McDonald. In the last half century, under the mounting informational influences, the use of appropriation as a poetic tool has moved from the outskirts of abject plagiarism to a semi-accepted practice. And Erasure is meant to be one of the practices that spring out of that kind of development. So now, within this whole context of the digital and creativity and plagiarism and kind of in shifted status, where where do omission and song really fit, and why these two together, and what do they do, and do they do anything in particular, and if so, what do they do maybe differently? And I'd like to suggest that maybe looking at Janet Holmes's The MS of Making, one of the erasures I've already mentioned earlier, is a good way of starting to consider these questions. As I mentioned before, this is the volume that's erasing Emily Dickinson's poems. And Holmes focuses specifically on her 1891 and 1892 poems that goes back to the first years of the United States Civil War. And Holmes uses this material as a kind of creative springboard for her response to another war, America's invasion of Iraq. So she is writing a war into a story kind of another war almost. And this is Holmes commenting on the choice of erasure as a creative practice in that particular context to talk about this particular theme. I myself had a very difficult and unsuccessful time trying to write about the war and was seeking a way to do it. Here, Emily Dickinson's writing opened up a way for me and seemed to permit a collaboration with my intentions. And in an interview for Kenyon Review, she also says that she turns to erasure out of act of desperation. So this kind of inability to find language to speak of historical trauma of Iraq war in Holmes's case is an issue that also pervades McDonald's and Phillips's erasure projects. Unlike all the examples of writing under erasure I've mentioned at the start of the talk, Philip and McDonald do not appropriate literary texts in their creative practice. And what the two have in common is an engagement with a particular kind of source texts that then they work with. Where Holmes's texts are literary, she reads and writes the Iraq war into the lines of Emily Dickinson's poetry. MacDonald and Philip resort to non-literary material to create literature. They turn into the discourse of the document, of law and history, and the archive to create the poetry that they create in the process. So the kind of shift from the literary to non-literary source can be, I think, illustrated quite nicely and quite explicitly by the reference to a similar development in visual arts. So Holmes Holmes versus MacDonald, and Holmes is to MacDonald, is for experimental literature what Rauschenberg is to Jenny Holter, really. So this is Robert Rauschenberg's Erase the Koenig's Drawing, that probably quite a few of you are familiar with, 1953. That's using the Koenig's Drawing to create the work that's basically just a frame. And on next to it, on your right, is Jenny Holter's 2006 redaction painting that I've already mentioned before. So, considered through the kind of through the lens of those particular source texts that these two writers work with, and these two artists work with, erasure becomes a particular mode of poeticizing the political, a tool for reclaiming the political as a source of aesthetic work. And these are words of Sigmund Reddy, who's another erasure poet. So for Philip, engaging with the range of experimental strategies employed in song to deconstruct a legal document grows out of her interest in questions of language and authority. She compares her creative strategies to the approach adopted by language poets, pointing to their shared interest in questioning the objectivity and transparency of discourse. Erasure writing inevitably exemplifies a mode of procedural writing under constraint, where the source text itself characteristically becomes a limitation. It's a confined and confining repository of language as material to be then cut and pasted and erased and mashed up. So working with the erasure technique, Philip brings attention to issues of restrictions and impediments of language, of the constraints of writing and utopianism of an idea of freedom of expression. An embodiment of writing that's kind of always inhibited by the trace, if I'm to turn to Derrida again. So, the two-page report, this is a quote from Phillips. The two-page report set out the fact, situation, and the reasons for the decision. When first faced with the decision, I was convinced that the stories of the events that took place on board of the song were locked into those 2 pages. My challenge was to figure out a way to get to those stories. What transpires in this claim, and many others that Phillips making about her own text, the song is published with quite an extensive essay in which Philip comments on her erasure. But what transpires here is an assumption that the report in itself is already an erased document. Erasure is really inherent to the dynamics of legal discourse and legal writing. In itself, a mode of writing under constraint, characteristically removing all unnecessary material, affective content, and context to arrive, in Philip's words, at a desiccated principle of law. And a really similar claim can be made about the 9/11 report, and that's kind of how it's attracted a lot of criticism. It's only presented the official truths, the convenient truths, removing facts and details that should not become publicly available. So Phillips and McDonald's modes of erasure act as erasures of an erasure, and attempts at dissecting the layers of erasure to get to that ghostly palimpsest, and that's a quote from Philip as well. But this kind of multi-layered mode of appropriation serves essentially as a method of uncovering that which might have been cancelled by the initial process of erasure, a method of reintroducing, especially for Philip, the emotions and feelings, personal stories that were removed, a poetic form to express the acts of not telling. What really transpires is the suitability of erasure as a form of bearing witness. For bearing, here's another quote, this story which can't be told, which must be told, but through not telling. And this is the kind of discourse that Philip engages in a lot when she discusses her own practice. That kind of attitude also opens up a particular creative space for something that echoes with the kind of Cajun poetics of silence, particularly poignant in the context of the story that Philip is engaging in, giving voice to African silence on board of Zong during the massacre. There's a clear parallel that can be drawn between the visual gaps on the page and silences established in the process of telling the story. Erasure as a mode of writing materializes the silence, makes the silence visible, turning into a visual representation of the inaudible. Not so much a recombinant narrative, as Philip argues, but a recombinant unt-narrative, the story that can't ever be told. So the erasure, that, in the way that Philip practices it, turns into a mode of textual supplementation rather than destruction. Erasure, to paraphrase Phillips and McDonald, as the possibility of applying something to text rather than removing from it. So McDonald's narrative is a very similar attempt at reading between the lines of official history. The kind of presumed certainties of the official, seemingly objective history and access to it is shaken, and an alternative history kind of emerges in the process. And this is a quote from the omission report itself, which is kind of a very self-reflexive text, a history written against fact and against form. In the transition from the report to the repo, the awareness seems to emerge that an attempt to uncover the events leading to 9/11 is really an impossibility, because as the omission reads again, the eye lacked the ability to know what it knew. There was no effective mechanism for knowledge. Viewed as such, omission repo and Zong both really emerge as a manifestation of particular distrust of the concept and for the concept of history. History conceived as an ultimate reality and as a source of authorized meaning and imposed truths. It is through writing under erasure that conditions of possibility can be, in particular ways, explored. But as every condition of possibility essentially really remains a condition of impossibility, just so that I become a bit greedy in here, the subversive alternative exploration of historical meaning that erasure makes possible can only be accessed against form, against fact, and afforded through acts of kind of critical engagement with the authority of history and the archive. So erasure seen as such offers particular alternative means of remembering, responding to the void, be it cultural or historical, with another void, one created by gaps on a page that hide existing text and at the same time reveal new meanings, making use of someone else's words where words are lacking. This kind of trajectory, there's quite an interesting trajectory that really grows out of the juxtaposition of history and the official discourse with those new texts that are created. With both of the erasures appropriating and engaging with law to different extent, Quite important kind of legal issues also arise in the context, especially when we try to consider these in the context of copyright categories. Both Rexon versus Gilbert, the Zong case, and 9/11 report do not, in using these as material for Erasure, they do not pose any copyright issues at all, and definitely not in the same way that appropriating literature might, some literature might. Both are examples of copyright exceptions, and they both exempt from copyright protection. The case that Philip is using, this is a legal court case, report, and it's freely available. The 9/11 report is a document published by US government, and it's not protected by copyright under US constitutional law. So neither really pose copyright issues that quite a lot of erasures of literary texts, of texts that are still in copyright, would. But these texts also are public in a kind of extra legal way, in that they preserve a shared official memory of historically significant events. There is a certain sense of entitlement and permissiveness to access and use these source texts that transpires in the approach that McDonald and Philip show in the different interviews, especially McDonald. And he pointed out in one of the interviews, commenting on the potential copyright issues that using the 9/11 report could generate, and this is a quote, "Since I was not erasing a literary text, I justified the act with the fact that my taxpayer dollars had paid for both the compilation and production of the document at hand, so I considered myself, by all rights, part owner of the original 9/11 Commission report." So the categories of traditional authorship do not seem to apply here, but not because of potential attribution challenges, but because of the nature of historical memory, of shared ownership of history, and the past preserved in what could be described as a sphere of freely accessible cultural commons. And just to really wrap it up, Michael Leon, who's kind of a writer and artist engaging with lots of appropriation practices himself, suggested formal limitations and constraints of working with Erasure, the difficulty of composing new texts out of existing texts, become, when considered in the context of the source text that Philip and McDonald engage in, a reflection on the difficulty of representing challenging, momentous, poignant subject matters. Issues and events that, to really return to the Janet Holmes' statement that they've quoted earlier in the paper, prove particularly challenging to express otherwise. Difficult subjects, traumatic, underexplored ones, require difficult form of expression. So it would seem, judged based on those practices that Philip and McDonald engage in. So seen through those lenses, Erasure as a compositional method becomes a tool for dealing with trauma, an alternative method of remembering, a mechanism for re-memory, to borrow from Toni Morrison, that conventional language and compositional methods cannot access. Philip recovers the memory of Africans killed on board of Zong. McDonald creates an alternative narrative of 9/11, both working towards, as Michael Owen puts it, a way of preventing the hijacking of our collective memory by ideological interests. Thank you very much, and I've got just to show you one more. This is quite a famous erasure in a kind of quite a hyperbolic sense. This is Tom Raud's University Days, and all you get is a text that says this poem removed for further study. So I thought I'll end on this erasure. Thanks a lot.
So now we have Linda Toigo, who is a book artist and graphic designer. Her work's been exhibited in galleries and libraries throughout the UK and Europe, and she spoke at a conference called Books 3 years ago, called Book Destruction, which was probably the highlight of her career. And also you won, the origami competition.
I won,
Yeah, you did. That was definitely.
that was my highlight. Okay. So, good afternoon. My name is Linda Toigo, and first of all, I want to thank Sarah, Tony, and Jill for involving me in this this kind of conversation that would put my practice into a more theoretical background. And I hope this would, what you will see, will lead to further development of my practice through your questions and through our conversation. I started my career as an architect, so I studied and worked for 3 years before deciding that that was not the scale that belonged to me. So I went back to studies and I studied graphic design. My final work was book design that at the end ended up being an experimental book design, where book destruction was more important of the book production. So that would be the first point of my talk today, that will focus on other 6 points. So first of all, I will talk about how book destruction can be considered a kind of a reading experience in a specific example. Then I will talk about how the discarding, like the erasure of written words, can create a silent dialogue within what stays on the page. Then I will show examples where I assign value to volumes through their destruction. Then I will show an example where book alteration is strictly related to moving image and digitalizing the image. Then I will show some example of carving books and considering books as cultural objects. And then the controversial idea of burning books. And then finally, to link everything to Kaja's work, I will show a new example of text erasure to create new meanings. So, as I was saying, graphic design led me to create, to work on book design. And the final work from my diploma studies was a project that was created to respond to this question. Is it possible to communicate the meaning of a text-based book by using unconventional media and format, and by confounding readers' expectation through the use of elements of surprise and interaction? I brought my book here, you can pass around if you wish. So that was a book, an experimental design based on the novel of Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, where all the narratives have been separated and organized into different way of placing the text, of using material, of working with images, so that the reader is strongly engaged through the structure of the book, through the image, but most of all through the interaction. So the book has small booklets inside, there are images to be overlapped, there are, as you can see, pages to be opened and closed again, so that the act of reading is an actual act of plunging into the book. And through this physical contact with the book, it's a way to understand deeper the meaning of the book, or at least the meaning that I was assigned to the book itself. The reader is asked to make choices that require a physical action and a psychological involvement. The same way it happens to the characters of the novel. In fact, to access part of the text, it is necessary to read some of the pages. I would not ask you to do it today because this doesn't belong to me. But it was quite interesting to see how 3 years ago, in the peak of my career, another copy of that book that actually belonged to me, so I could do it, was passing around the same way. And a person was flipping through the pages, and I stopped him and asked him, "Can you read that page?" And he reacted, this is how he had to do. So the idea is you read the page and then you get small booklets. Those small booklets contain the final chapter of the book. And by tidying up the booklets, you end up with an image that reveals what is actually the meaning of the book itself. And I hope I'm not spoiling. So I was quite touched, and it was very interesting for me to see how the level of controversy that this idea of ripping a book, even if that was asked from the person that had created the book, was developing what was happening in the mind of the people that were there in front of me. And this led me to want to focus more on the idea of book destruction, more than on the book production. And this is what brought me here 3 years later to show what's happened since. So a different way of approaching book that I experimented through the years have been to work on image-based books and to work on the idea of get a readable text and see what happens only through the interaction between the images. So in this book in particular, that is a book about French films, the chronological order that is normally dictated by the paper, the physical presence of the paper, and the fact that pages have to be flipped in order to flip through the chapters, that have been overtaken through the act of cutting in order that a unique relation between the images could be created. So the written text have been removed and the images have been carefully selected. So I only kept every image that would show a human figure. And the result is a kind of a silent dialogue between characters that would never see each other that way on a cinema screen, because they would not belong to the same film or to the same period. This way, my spatial alteration of the book gets to be strongly connected to a different way of perceiving the time that the book is describing at that moment. And that time is no more a logical sequence, but it's a simultaneous existence of distant periods, of distant decades. And these can be done also, can be seen from the first page for the fact that the cover was removed. And so the book became almost a tableau, or like one image that would communicate immediately the old content of the book. The process has been documented in a short video that can show how the alteration of the book progressed through it with continuous choices and adjustments. Kind of approach that belongs to my practice, but another interest that I have is how book destruction, so the destruction, the physical alteration of books can actually assign a value to them. So the practice of book destruction is raising more and more ethical questions, and I've been asked, is that morally right? Is it correct to destroy an object that is so strongly connected to our culture, to our historical value, that in a time where books are going out to print, why destroying something that has such a strong importance? At least for our generation and the following generation now, the attitude may be changing. But what happens to the perception of an author book when the same kind of practice is applied to a volume that has just a functional value, and whose functional value is much more important than its actual material quality? So I took an Argos catalogue from a bunch of hundreds of Argos catalogues that was left in a corner of a shop and nobody was actually using, because everybody is using it the online. So the interesting thing of this project is the actual tension that is created between the lack of material quality, the lack of recognized value of a catalog that gets generally just thrown away after it's used for a few seconds. And the actual big amount of time, craftsmanship, thoughts that was involved in the altering process that was based in choosing a very iconic, high-level, culturally level image. In this case, it's the Tondolone from Michelangelo, and to print it directly on the pages of the catalogue. So that there are very interesting interactions created between the printed image and the existing content, such as, for example, the Holy Family scoring a goal, scoring a basket with the baby as the basketball. So then the pages were cut into a sequence of concentric, very, very small circles that through the superposition would reveal millimetric fragments of the inserted image. And it's interesting to see the connection, how the idealized family and the modern family photographed in the catalogue can lock eyes to each other to create a kind of a dialogue somehow between two different cultural situations, between high culture and low culture. So that was an example, but I've done other examples. For example, this question was leading the alteration of this other kind of book, that is an out-of-date travel guide. Who would go to Brazil with a guide that was printed 15 years ago? It would be like a suicide. So you would not find anything that is actually written on the guide. And so what happens to this kind of guide is to be replaced with something else, to like end up in the bottom shelf of the bookshelf, or just in a charity shop, where I actually found this book that through an alteration like this is assigned a new aesthetical value, and all the value that you would assign to a well-recognized brand of travel guide goes back to is given back to the book through giving the book another reason to live and to make him survive its natural fate. And this is another work that is a new project. It's called Vanity Fair, and this is shown here in its first page. So I'm carving women's magazines on their covers, so that I create a complex layered portrait that alter the perception of the object with their disturbing feel. And again, it's giving reason to be to paper objects that can still be considered books, because like the general definition of a book is a series of pages bound together. So through book alteration, through book destruction, I'm actually creating a value for things for objects that don't have a value. The next step, the next description of my practice is connected to my interest with moving image, and in particular, the project responds to a interest in hand-drawn animation and in the need to investigate the possible relation between the physical quality of the book and the digital image. I brought here the book that was created for this project. So the idea is to frame to paint each frame directly onto the pages of this found anthology of allegories and myths, where the general field and the general idea of the animation is strongly connected with the content of the book. The connection between the illustrations and the printed text is very strong because the main character dances within the space of the book, uses the space of the book completely. He rips the pages, he uses them to plant a tree, and then he observes the evolution of his new creatures while hiding behind the gutter, the central line of the book. So the open book itself becomes the scene of the animation, but also keeps a very strong physical presence that is signaled by a background sound of flipping pages. Now I'm going to show you the short animation that was a result of this research. Another way of altering books and using it and trying and see how the physical quality of them can be thrown in space somewhere there in a digital world. This is a more, let's say, traditional way of approaching books and considering books has, let's say, a brick made of paper, which is a spatial paper because it has a content, it has text, it has images, and whatever you do with that brick would work with the volume, but also would connect the volume to the actual content, what the book is talking about. And I'm presenting a couple of images from a project that was created to respond to a call for book artists. It was created I answered to it in 2011, and it was a call that was issued to commemorate the bombing of Al-Mutanab Street. It was it's still a cultural street in the center of Baghdad, where there were still a lot of second-hand bookshops and literary cafe where all the poets and the literates were gathering to talk about books. Someone put a car with a lot of explosive in it and everything exploded. But an American artist, issued this call for artists, asking book artists from all over the world to complete 3 books that would reflect the strength and the fragility of books but also they would show the endurance of the ideas within them. So I responded to it, creating 3 works that would investigate on the material beauty of the book and in its volumetric quality. I printed anatomical illustrations on the books, on the pages, and then I cut them out to create new shapes into a volume of 3 history books. So the text is not readable anymore. It loses its readability, it loses its initial what it was created for, but the book itself gets a different sense. What the book is about is still there, and it still comes out with a different. It's no more a logical way of perceiving it. It's more an emotional way of existing. I brought another example of approaching books with a sculptural idea. So this was created in response to a short story that presents of 2 miniature characters changes the scale of this family cookery book and transforms the pages into a suspended landscape. And this is again another example where this is a book about history of the built world, and the pages have been cut through by irregular and unstable paths that have transformed the solid volume of the page of the book into a fragile lace work. And the fragment of the text and the images look up from the oaths to suggest the coexistence of different historical periods. So that was more, traditional and sculptural approach to book destruction, and now that's something that I've been criticized about, because burning book is strongly related to the idea of censorship, of annihilation of a culture. Wherever there is a strong power that wants to control the population, there is book destruction, and usually there are these big images with these like iconic images of big fire and book burning. So the intent of this experimental approach to book alteration was to use the destroying element of fire as a creative tool. So every page of an history school book has been separately burned into a slow and quite intoxicating process. I was smelling of bacon at the end of and that involved a match, quick reaction of my fingertips, and some chance. So the element of chance was very important, because fire goes wherever it wants to go. The result is an organic form carved into the volume of the book, where the book is still there, the volume is still recognizable. Again, you cannot read what's written, but you can perceive it. So history is visible through fragments of faces, of text, of specific words that have been preserved in order to talk to the reader that opens the book and suggests connection between the different decades. This is a little video, short video, that documents the balance between the element of chance and the certain level of control that I wanted to keep on the destructive process. So in order to avoid a complete destruction of the book, every page, at a specific moment I wanted, or less, to be, had to be pushed down into a glass surface. So this is how I did it. So you can see how fire is used almost, like the match is almost a brush. And instead of painting, I'm burning. But it can be controlled. Sometimes it can't. Sometimes the old page ended up being burnt. But then the superposition of all the layers and the burnt layers created this pattern. So this is another way of approaching book destruction through their burning. And the last part was created specifically to respond to Kaja's lecture paper, and it will focus on the erasure of text to create new meanings. So I brought the book that I'm doing. It's still a work in progress, but because I started it recently on purpose for this, but I wanted to share it with you because I thought it would be a good conclusion for this meeting. It has been specifically created to respond to this paper, and it started with the choice of the least literary book that could be found in the local charity shop, which is a do-it-yourself volume titled Repair Your Own Home Electrical Appliance. The book that I altered then was retitled Repair Your Own Book, which is the first page of the book that has part of the title and the last line where you have the edition shown. The process consisted in analyzing the text page by page and to identify single words that, extracted from the context, would assume different meanings if rearranged with other words on the same page. So in a part where dust bag and filters are analyzed, we're talking about hoovers, we can find something like make sure your hand is blocked before you feel the inevitable. So I'm going to quickly talk about the actual process. So once a sentence has been isolated, it has been masked by tape. The page has temporarily been extracted from the book and passed through a printer. Then, after the image had been printed on the page, the tape would be removed and the shapes could be cut out so that only the relevant text could be perceived. This process continued for every page to create a juxtaposition of colorful and investing paper inserts, each carrying a disturbing, cryptic sentence. You cannot imagine what you can find in that. For example, good connection may be replaceable. You will deal with failure. Life is not generally difficult to spare. Light comes too soon. Water cannot rise above water. Push back the river. And this is just the beginning. So if you want to read the last part of the book, there are still white pages that haven't been cut. If you find something that the oracle wants to tell you, you can share it with me and it will be credited. So this was my way of describing my practice in the past 3 years. I hope this will raise some questions and discussions. Thank you very much.
Wow, great, thanks. Thanks both of you. I think there's probably going to be quite a lot of questions, so I'm going to get in first. And I think I don't know if this is necessarily one question. Maybe this is something we can, other people might want to pick up on in different ways. But I'm interested in the place of literature, like the literary object and the category of literature, and what it is that we're dealing with when we deal with altered books or the poetry of Erasure. And there seemed to be that seemed to be played out, or this kind of the subtext of a question about literature seemed to be kind of played out in both of your presentations. So Linda was experimenting with Argos catalogues and cookbooks and the least literary text that she could find, which was the DIY manual. And Kaja, I mean, you explicitly set out to tell us about poems that appropriate non-literary material. So you were also interested in the kind of use of books that aren't considered normally to have much value. So there's a question about literary value, maybe, kind of using texts that don't fall into the category of literature. But I think more specifically, there's the kind of interplay between your two talks might raise a question about the relationship between not just the literary and the non-literary, but literature and art, because what sort of objects are these? What sort of objects are ones that you create? Are they books or are they art? And also, what sort of objects are these poems, these texts that you were talking about? Are they still poems? I mean, some of them seemed to occupy some sort of place in the middle, maybe, of kind of literature and art. So this is what I suppose this is my first kind of question. I know it's a bit of a huge one, but what sort of objects are these? Are we dealing with art or literature, or is there some sort of new space in between that is opening up?
Well, I believe that it is necessary to go beyond the idea of two covers and pages, because we've already been going beyond it with the digitalization of texts. And these kind of practice, from my point of view, is led to focus on something else, on the beauty of the material book, but also on the relation with the content itself. Is a book that doesn't have a square page but has insects instead? Why is it not a book? If you can hold 2,000 books in your hand, why removing part of the text would take away the pleasure of reading it? I think this is
it's a huge question. Sorry. For all the people involved in Erasure, it really depends. Because all of them really have an interest in typography and design, and that plays a very significant role in what they do. But a few people, and Janet Holmes, for instance, the woman who's erasing Emily Dickinson, she very explicitly says that she's interested in text. She's working with the text in the way she's working in a text because she still wants to preserve Dickinson, and she wants to preserve this kind of distance that's working with someone else's text is created, but she said that she's very explicitly interested in text, and it's not the work of graphic design. It's work. It's not the work of visual art. It's a text. That's the. But most of the people who work on Erasure are interested in game to play, and that's kind of something in between. Is definitely something that's really the kind of issue that's really running through all the discussions about Erasure. But also quite a few. There's been. I'm trying to remember where it was. There's been this kind of small festival somewhere in the US. Kind of experimental art a couple of years ago, and a few of the people who are involved in doing Erasures were interviewed in the panel. And something that was kind of cropping up was also the kind of issue of engaging with the work that's a literary work, and specifically engaging with the literary work that's done by someone who's a living author as well. And lots of people saying, I don't want to erase this, or I don't want to appropriate this text because this person is a living author. I go, well, I know them, or I know people who know them. I don't want to involve in that, but kind of a distance that working with them. It was easier. It was kind of less of an issue when you were working with something that was more removed from the present, and it was less of an issue when engaging with a text that's a non-literary work. That was kind of that kind of distance. That's the work that's not the work of literature. That was created that meant that people had less of an ethical issue of engaging with the text and destroying the text or appropriating the text, and also just kind of just using it seemed much less of an issue. Quite a few people say that the fact that this is a literary work that they don't want to touch it. So that kind of non-literary material seems to open up the kind of more comfortable space for the kind of exploration. You're not destroying someone else, although a report is still someone else's words, but they are not the kind of creative output, maybe not necessarily personal output, they are something else.
So there's something kind of easier about creating something real or intervening in something that's not already categorised as a literary object. Because if you have to do that, then you're taking it out of that rather than doing something else.
But then when you look at, I don't know of anyone who's been erasing stuff that's appropriation already, but stuff that, for instance, Goldsmith's work, when he takes a non-literary material, he takes, for instance, a radio station weather report, transcribes it word by word, and publishes it as a novel, publishes it as poetry. I don't know of anyone who's erasing something like that, but then there's a question of if I put my name on it and I publish it as a novel, then it's erasing this. Still the same, where do we draw a line? In terms of what you can, but
can you alter an alter?
Yeah, can you alter an alter book? It's probably a good idea. It's a good question.
Well, I had a question that kind of comes back to some of the points that Jill was making, which is that not to kind of get you to talk about whether your objects are art or books, and whether the writer's objects are art or books, but that in the way that Linda's presentation was delivered with these amazing videos, and also in terms of the writers whose work Kaja was talking about, there's display and documentation happening. So that I'm thinking, how do you display your books if you wanted to exhibit them? How does that work? But also that actually some of the really fascinating stuff is the documentation of your practice. And with Kaja's, so it was Holmes who said had this essay that kind of supplements what she's actually done to the text to contextualise it. Kenneth Goldsmith is the kind of theorist most associated with his practice, and everyone else who works like him. So there's this assumed need or space or usefulness to have a supplementary explanation, or always this kind of documentation of explaining the concepts behind the work. And this strikes me as something more associated with visual culture than with literary culture, where the explanation is presumed to be in there somewhere. And then there's the subsphere of academia to deal with the extra bits. But that actually these ideas of display, of documentation and extrapolation are kind of associated with the objects themselves in a way that's associated with visual culture rather than literary culture. And I just wondered if that was something you'd found in your work. And even just thinking about the pages you had up, which I don't know if this is part of your Jill was getting at as well. But if you look at, you pulled up to Kuning and Rauschenberg, and then you look at that other page, and you're like, well, yeah, that's an image. That's a kind of really graphic thing, and what the connection is.
Can I? Yeah, I believe the need to document is first of all connected to the social environment we are plunged now. So you do something and you need to share it not only with your community. You want it to be visible and to be understood in the other side of the world, but you need to do it through a digital media. I also think that this kind of work goes with the time that is involved in the work. The process is a very important element of the work itself. They can live there on their own, that's for sure, but I find it relevant, I find it important to actually share the work and the time, and as I said, for the Argos volume, for example, why is it so important for me? Because I actually dedicated so much time on that. So that's, I think it's my question is adding the element of time to the object itself.
I think kind of theorization, is it really just so characteristic for all those forms that both of us are talking about? I don't really think so. It's such a typical thing that happens. It happens more now than it happens in literature, but there are tons of writers in the kind of more traditional narrative tradition who also, or in more traditional poetic forms, who also write about their own work, maybe not in as explicit way and kind of pushy way as Goldsmith does it, but that's a very much a done thing. And with these works, maybe it's something you need a bit more of, because lots of the Erasure is slightly less so, but a lot of Goldsmith work, it's trying to be conceptual, and it's not trying to be the kind of standalone work text that's just there to be read. It's kind of trying to do something else. So maybe the fact that it's trying to do something else beyond the text itself needs a bit of an extra, like a conceptual work of art. But
do you find that, sort of just to push on the question a bit, that because the other thing I was thinking of was about the sort of methods of the writers you're talking about, and I mean, if they're tipexing or redacting, then it's kind of clear how they've gone about that. But the ones where they faded things, do they write about, in the way that Linda does, about whether those were scanned copies that they kind of then used a digitized file to fade, or?
Different people do different things, and most of the people who are just interested in text and text alone, I think, don't really tend to write that much about their practices, because then, like in the Shakespeare's sonnets, these are still standalone poems. But then there are those who write more. My impression is that the people who are engaged more in the kind of graphic side of things. So Ian Morrison, the woman who did the Conrad's Erasure, it was also done as a huge installation in Los Angeles, where people could come in, and there were massive prints on the walls of the pages, and people could come in and erase bits that they thought were related to colonialism and to nature, for instance. Or there are books that saw through pages of text that work, and that some of those people work as well. So it's kind of, there's almost this distinction where there is kind of slightly more experimental involvement with the text that goes beyond the page. There seems to be more theorization happening on it. At the same time, with people like Goldsmith, she's very explicitly just textual. The Dickinson erasures or Shakespeare erasures, these are kind of meant to be still standalone.
It's funny because I find them the weirder things, like when someone's really dealt with the object, even if you don't exactly know how to do it, it's so clear to see the markings. But Emily Dickinson one is, but how did you do that? Like, why is that great in that black and white?
Yeah, most people don't. I mean, for instance, the Tubex ones, there's quite a lot that she says explicitly about how it's done, because she's trying to preserve the actual effect that Tubexing is created. So those published books are still, their scans and then they're printed, but to preserve the kind of effect of indexing. So the ones that are more engaged with the visual than just the text, they do involve more theorization, but not all of them say anything about the method.
That's an interesting question, because I've been reading Craig Dworkin's book, No Medium, and he starts off by talking about all of these blank books as a whole kind of mini tradition of completely blank books that I suppose they're the ultimate kind of poetry of erasure. But he says, so if a book says nothing at all, then of course what actually it does, it's not saying anything, it's saying lots, but you find the meanings elsewhere in the kind of paratext and kind of the theoretical context that surrounds it. So yeah, I think his point is that you always have those paratexts, like works and even work in literature never really kind of explain themselves, you know, it's kind of drawing on the sort of theoretical context.
What I'm wondering is whether the question of literary value can actually be applied in any of these texts. I mean, not explicitly, for example, the one dealing with Emily Dickinson, because then you would have a very strong background to sort of compare that to, but the texts that are on the border between visual and textual, do they in any way concern themselves with literary value, and how can you sort of estimate or attribute a literary value to any of these texts?
I guess the question whether you can attribute to literary value is a huge one. This is an example. I very often use these texts when I teach at the first year undergrad, so I teach kind of some of the kind of access university level course, and they very often show those, and they make most of my students very angry, and most of them completely dismiss them as not literature, and they just can't accept something like this as a work that has literary value. They don't have a problem looking at the humour and kind of saying, yeah, but I don't see it as literature, but as a work of art. They don't have a problem in recognising it as a work of art, recognising it as a text, as a work of literature that has any value attached to it. It just doesn't fly. There's always one or two that are kind of interested, but the general feel, and I've done that quite a few times now, is that it's a no, that you can't assign value to it. But these are obviously designed as individual and standalone works of art. They kind of engage with works of literature. They engage with the source text, but they also want to be new texts in their own right. Obviously, if you're doing that as an author, then you're trying to create a new work of literature, even if it's a work of literature that's created out of a different one, that's still a work of literature.
Yes.
And some people are more successful than the others. I feel that the omission repo, for instance, reads much better if you read it alongside the report, which probably says quite a lot about how successful or not successful it is. I think it's a great piece, but when you pick it up on its own, and then when you pick it up having read the report, those are two completely different experiences, but different experiences in the sense that the actual erasure makes so much more sense and works much better, which means probably that if we're talking about kind of assigning value to that new piece, maybe it's not as successful as some others. But I think they can be treated as literary works in their own right.
I completely agree with the fact that they can be treated as literary works. What I'm actually asking is there a way to assess, if you consider them literary works, is there a way to assess their value, or simply the fact that they have manipulated the text in a way gives them an intrinsic aesthetical and literary value?
Well, no, I don't think the fact that they've manipulated other literary text immediately gives them an intrinsic literary value, not at all. We spoke a bit about stuff in forestry of codes before we started, and I don't think it's successful at all. I think it's working with a great source text. I don't think what it's done to it is very successful. I don't think it's working very well, and I don't think really the form and content have anything to do with each other. So, the fact that it worked with a really amazing literary text has given value to the outcome. So I don't think that's something that can be said at all. In terms of assigning literary value, I don't really know. There's this whole idea of kind of a test of time where we assign literary value, and that's probably one way of looking at it. I think that the best you can do with them in terms of here and now, looking at those erasures and thinking whether they are of any literary value or not, and just kind of picking them up and seeing how they hold on their own as text, and if they do, then maybe there is, a high level of value to them.
But something interesting has happened to Tom Phillips as a human in that respect, because that's one of the kind of more that if there is a canon of the poetry of Erasure or the altered book, then that surely belongs to it. But it's, he first published it in the 60s, but it was an art. It was exhibited in the context, I think it was exhibited at the ICA, and first of all it only found an outlet in the context of art galleries, but it's now kind of made some sort of move into the literary sphere, and now it's on courses, English courses, you're teaching it in Durham, and it's been on courses here at Berkeley. So I think that's one way to answer that question, is that as with anything else, like if something's around long enough, its reputation kind of goes up and people write about it, then it becomes kind of canonical. And it's now a human is something that is the same text, although actually it's not really. He keeps reworking it, but it now has some kind of status of poetry rather than just a kind of an artist experiment. Can I address your question to Linda?
It was addressed both ways.
Maybe in a kind of different way. Do you see what you do as kind of authorship? I know you primarily see yourself as an artist, and you see what you create in objects, but is there a kind of authorship? Are you creating literary objects to be read?
As a literary authorship, well, I mainly worked with the material quality of books so far, and the latest experiments I did is the first one I worked. I wanted to work with words, and I more find it interesting in the way someone gets closer to a page, to a text, whatever the text is, and challenges that text to respond to a specific interest in finding something out. Then in the idea of becoming a poet, because I can extract cryptic meanings out of that page.
Do you ever, I don't know, because I've not looked, do you keep the original authors' names in the books, or do you put your name anywhere in the book?
I don't.
Yeah.
I don't. Yeah, I don't do it. I usually like to keep the covers. The history of the book, more than it's belonging to another author, is interesting for me. I believe that once the book, because also they are mainly discarded books. Books are found on the street after a book fair or in a charity shop at the very last shelf. I take them with all the the history they have as books, as objects, not as published items. So I'm more interested in observing the stains that they have on their pages, the people they have belonged before. I find it much more fascinating to work with the signatures I find on the front pages. For example, with this, the Bird book. Yeah, the subtitle of the book is Suggestions for Further Study for Jack Crosby. That's because on the front page and on the following page, like big signature of the actual pupil that was owning this book and was getting his studies out, his knowledge out of the book. And this is much more fascinating to me than the actual author that's printed the book and sent it to the world.
That's a very different attitude to what all the erasure writers I work on do, because there's the exact opposite. So, for instance, the art kind of writer / artist, and she speaks of herself as an artist more than a writer who does the tipexing. She also, in all the books that she's working on, she tipexes the author's names, and very often by hand puts her name instead. And they all kind of reclaim in the process. They kind of reclaim the authorship. They all have the names of the erasurists on the cover. They don't contain the original, or kind of do a mix of both. There's this guy who's erasing Ashbery, and he's got his name and then saying the erasures of Ashbery, but of Ashbery's poetry. But they kind of, there's always the kind of act of claiming the authorship over what they've done with it. So it's the exact opposite to what you're doing.
It's kind of cheeky, isn't it? It's like they are invested in the idea of relationship, even though they're kind of that relationship.
Jekyll and Hyde. So like this, you see, this is still. Is this by Linda Toigo?
This is started as a design, so you would put it more into the book design and the graphic design area. So I'm respecting the text. I didn't change anything of the text. All the order is totally respected, apart from the last chapter where you have to go back. But it's clearly signals how you can read it. So the name of the author, the writer, is written on the book, and the book has been designed by me. And this is
It's a third mind of collaboration.
yeah, like from centuries. So when in this case there is a sort of a strong sort of respect towards the author, and actually your design, your work was based on understanding deeper and in a deeper way what the text wanted to say, and giving my own ideas of what I got from it, but starting from the history of the writer himself, and of course researching about what he wanted to say. So it's in that case it's less of a fight.
Yeah, because there is I mean this thing about the poets of Erasure kind of stamping their authorship and their identity on the poetry. There is a kind of there's a competition or an antagonistic relationship set up between the person who's reworking the book and the person who produced it in the first place. So in that sense, maybe it's easier to rework a non-literary object or a bad book, like the Argos catalogue. You're not in battle with someone famous or canonical.
In a way, there is a kind of an argument attitude, because who are you to decide where's why are your students getting angry with the Dickinson and not with, when do you need to respect and why don't I respect the author or the do-it-yourself book, which is quite good. I didn't know so much about Wolverine before. Because I actually need to read the text like many times before finding out what the text can become. So you actually get to know it a lot. And probably this is my way of respecting what the books, how the book was made and who wrote it. I get to know it and then destroy it.
Because Tom Phillips, when he chose Malek's A Human Document, which was the kind of obscure Victorian novel that he created the humament from, he claims that he never read it. He went to a job shop and with 3 pence in his pocket and said, I'm going to buy a book for 3 pence and I'm going to doctor it. And he claims that he never actually sat down and read the book. So like that's the ultimate kind of 2 fingers to the original author, but it's probably not to actually.
We were trying to work this out though, whether there'd been any like research, like a kind of Malek studies that had come around from Tom Phillips' investment in that book.
Well, you can buy it.
Victorian scholarship picked up on that.
Well, you can buy it now, and it was out of print for ages. Now I just bought it. It's print on demand, but it's now you can buy it on Amazon. So it's at least it's made it back on Sweden.
Is it any good?
It's awful.
There you go.
No, but it's interesting because if you're kind of reading back, you're reading backwards. So it's like reading, looking at one of your texts and then kind of reading the original. So you're kind of you're looking back behind what
you know.
what Tom Phillips has done. Yeah. And also, it's funny because you can't recover the original text. You're always reading it through the altered version. So, because a lot of what Tom Phillips does in The Human is quite funny and smutty, and there's a lot of double entendre, you see that in the original text. There's lots of stuff about well-hung carriages and people playing with their knickknacks.
That's what he says, he's never read it.
I think it's very interesting what you say about the respect that you pay towards the original author. And I think it links very well with this paranoia of the modern time of authorship, of something, you have an idea and it's yours, and you have to boundaries around it. And I think a good example in a way to treasure is that I know is how Western music was developed especially in the 15th and 16th century. And these guys were actually studying each other very well, very deep, and then digging stuff out and making them yours. Many times they didn't even sign Mozart is known to go to concerts and copy the whole thing down, and only recently a few of his works were accredited to other people. But he didn't do it on purpose, he just copied it. He just wanted to get to know it. So I think this paranoia that we have in terms of should I be more respectful, less respectful, how, when, I think is a sign of how the physicist approach to the work of art that is actually more more interested in the social acceptance of the author rather than the actual nature of the piece of art. So, in a sense, I think we should turn around as you were saying, turn around the perspective and why should the artist, an artist like Linda or all the others you mentioned, be irrespectful of the original author, instead of the original author using the words he used in, I don't know, Shakespeare's words. Someone else has given the meaning to those words. He has been using those words. So how can we say that Shakespeare wasn't himself irrespectful to other people for stealing things and stuff? So it's a never-ending chain, and I think it's a really distracting point, this problem of the authorship, and it's really, as I said, diminishing the value of the work of art and diverting the discussion towards social acceptance and things that are not related to art.
I do agree in many respects, but also, when you bring up early modern developments in either musical composition or, the same parallel things been happening in literature at the same time, then you need to bear in mind that a lot happened in terms of kind of cultural, intellectual, economic, legal developments since, and the conception of authorship in 16th century Europe has been a very different one to the one that's developed over the ages. Copyright didn't exist, and it was very different intellectual culture that's very much based on mimesis and the kind of recognition. The copying was the recognition of your background, that was a kind of appreciation of your training, and that attitude really changed with the kind of growth of the kind of 19th century romantic author and development of copyright and rest. And lots of other things that kind of, but a lot's happened in the kind of attitudes to creativity and authorship in many respects, both in creative terms and kind of economic legal terms, that influenced the shifted attitude. So I do agree in many respects, but I also think that there's lots that's influenced this kind of shift and the change in attitude as well. There's not just a contemporary paranoia, there's something much bigger and culturally and economically and politically as well.
Yeah, I understand the economic side of it, but I'm really concerned about this fetishistic approach towards the representation of art, and in an art like music, in which you have to actually constantly reproduce it to make it alive. I'm concerned about the effect of this paranoia, what I call paranoia, in the actual creative process of making new art. I think we should really ask ourselves why it was such a creative moment, the 15th, 16th, 17th century in our culture, and why now we have a stagnating cultural environment.
But do you really think that's necessarily the case? I don't, because I would say that what you're saying is a bit more of a fetishization of the historical. Why do we think that the 16th century music or literature, why do we think that Shakespeare is such an incredible piece, and why do we assume that piece of literature, and why do we think that now we're stagnating? Shakespeare was popular entertainment at the time, and his work changed status over these. So I think there's lots to say to that as well, and there's lots of criticism of the kind of current cultural moment, but that's something that happens over the ages as well. In the kind of the current cultural moment, whenever you look in intellectual history or kind of aesthetic history, tends to be criticised as the kind of less, a bit of a less great, less impressive, and it's the historical, the canonical that's more appreciated. So I don't necessarily agree that it's been an amazing time in cultural history in the 16th century and we're now stagnating. I think there's lots of I'm sorry, because I've kind of completely taken over.
No, I kind of agree, and also because of the social organization that creates links between artists and writers all around the world, you can create collaborations and free sharing of material to create shared work of art.
But that's what I mean.
But it's the case
free
that
shared.
But it's the case that the
Freely shared.
the problem of copyright as it kind of reaches a zenith with digital media in terms of huge court cases of kids that have downloaded a couple of tracks being kind of sued by Universal or whoever, actually is a kind of radical drawing of attention to the complacency of the 20th century, to the fact that we have a sort of out-of-date copyright constitution that's just been left because it kind of wasn't an issue that people could work around it, and now we have this a kind of cultural climate that's acutely aware of how our system's failing to kind of, or how it precludes certain ideas of creativity, and how that's happening in exciting ways, but often in peripheral spaces, like the kind of the avant-garde writers, I guess, that Kaja's working on. But this is a positive. This makes us part of a moment of change, a moment where everyone, the fact that, and this I think goes back to what Kaja was saying, and kind of what Linda's saying now, which is the fact that, if the human was out of its time in some way, that these writers are kind of of their time, that's in part because we're actually now in a moment where we're paying attention to the necessary, the kind of need for creativity to be able to reappropriate the fact that that's part of creative work. And so this is a positive time. And actually, when you're teaching undergraduates, often you can say this is a lot like what Chaucer did with this text and what happened here. And there's kind of quite a distinct parallel, just teaching undergraduates. I'm saying that because I had to teach them in the course recently. But yeah, there's kind of parallels if you want to talk about a sort of moment of change and impetus and people kind of not being depressed and put down by issues of copyright and fear and reverence for literary authorship.
But just to kind of jump on what Sarah's saying and the kind of idea of the more historical approach to creativity, I don't know if any of you have ever heard of this guy called Gerald Longbain, who was a kind of borderline, I think it's late 16th, early 17th century. And it's kind of this time when kind of copyright is starting, kind of the new notions of authorship are kind of starting to emerge. And he has exactly the same problem that we have with what's going on in the digital context today. He's been compiling dictionaries of plagiarisms that he's talking about, and he's kind of been picking up on texts that copy other texts. It's exactly the same discussion that's going on in the digital context. And he kind of makes a distinction between copying from historical text and copying from his contemporaries. And he's kind of doesn't have a problem with copying from the historical material because it's a done thing at a time, it's the kind of appreciation of, but appreciation of your own learning and the kind of showing of your grounding in it. But copying of your contemporaries is not okay because it's a material that's not really of enough value for you to even engage in the act of copying it, because there's nothing in it for you. If you want to copy the material that's historical, because you want to copy the classics, because the classics are your intellectual basis for whatever you're doing. But he's doing exactly the same thing. There's this whole discussion going on in this massive volumes that he's compiling of plagiaries. And there's exactly the same concern, like who do you draw from and why do you draw from them and where are your sources and how, and he's kind of going through texts and that are now considered, and now for instance assigned Dryden, and he's just picking up what Dryden potentially copied from whom and what, and kind of assigns value to these sources. So it's exactly the same. It's exactly the same discussion in a way, similar as well, because there's a massive shift in authorship at a time, the kind of approaches to authorship at a time, and we're kind of going through a shift in authorship now. But it's a very similar discussion going on. But then we don't, I guess maybe just what you're saying, kind of like we now recognise that this is a good thing, and we kind of acknowledge the fact that this is an appropriation, whereas those 16th and 17th century texts just kind of, that we read now, don't recognise it as an act of appropriation at all. But there is lots of the same going on, the same kind of practice happening behind the scenes that we're talking about today.
I've got a couple of minutes left.
I do have a question which might be on a limb here, but I believe I heard this, sort of the dynamics of deference versus making better in this sort of, let's say, avant-garde dynamic of movement. But what I'm talking about is the fact that all fairly well-known authors that work with really well-known authors seem to have a sort of deference towards the text, trying to re-emphasize the content in a sort of sublimated way. As, for example, even if it's successful or not, Forward seems to do. I haven't read The Endless of My Kid, but you know what I've noticed is that when you're dealing with a well-known author, you sort of try to re-emphasize the content of the book, and even if you're putting it in a new light, you are very much concerned with the actual content of the book. Whereas when you're dealing with non-literary material or literary material of a lesser value, like Tom Phillips, for example, he seems to he seems to make better, in a way, the material that he's working with. And I was actually wondering on the Wave Books website whether you can see this sort of dynamics and if it's actually there when people that are not established authors are working with major texts, if there is this sort of deference and sublimated content that they're trying to reach.
I don't think it's really the case, and I don't know, I didn't have much time to go into much detail, but that's not really a rule in terms of kind of how you engage with the text. The original report, the text that raises the 9/11 report, is obsessed with the report. Every single I kind of briefly mentioned, but every single section is erased to reflect, the form is meant to reflect the content. And I somehow, I've heard this one interview with McDonald, and then that kind of, I spent a lot of time with this report trying to figure out, because he doesn't say anywhere, because there's very little, there's nothing written, there are no critical texts written about him, and there's just a couple of interviews. But it does speak to the text in a very kind of, mainly playing with kind of structural, semantical elements of the report, but it's very closely responding to the text. And so it's not really necessarily the rule, it's kind of more of an individual's attitude to what they're doing with Erasure than the actual work in the actual value of the source. Zong kind of does engage with the case report very much so, because it's kind of responding to it and it's trying to add the content that's missing from the document. And then there are some of the people who engage with the canonical that don't really engage with the canonical text that much. They're actually trying to create a new text that's a completely standalone piece that does not really speak to the original. So there's a real variety, and it really depends on an individual. In terms of the Wavebooks website, I've not gone through all of them, but the ones I've looked at, it really varies as well. And they're all anonymous. I mean, they've got usernames, so you don't really know who's playing with them as well. It might be some people who are doing that are kind of well established themselves. But so you don't know that. But there's a real variety of how people approach them. But there seems to be quite a lot of chance in it as well, and it's a kind of a quick thing to do.
I haven't actually seen any that do not engage with the canonical, so can you tell me which ones those are?
On Wavebooks?
No, just in general. All the books that I read in this area are sort of re-emphasizing the canonical, so I don't know which are the ones that are sort of trying to drift away.
Well, I would say that the ones that Johnson, the radios, is very much re-emphasizing Milton, and I think there's a big difference between Johnson's attitude and the attitude of the Erasure writers now. I don't think the MS of making the Emily Dickinson is really is engaging with the source text that much. She is writing, the idea that she's writing completely new text. She's using someone else's words to write her own, but that's the kind of way into her own text. She's not really responding, because Radio's the Milton erasure, it's Milton.
Yeah.
It's kind of appropriated Milton, but it's Milton. Whereas the Emily Dickinson erasures, they're not Emily Dickinson. They don't speak to the erasure that they work, the text they're working with. They're using it as a kind of framework, but they are a standalone new piece. The Shakespeare sonnets are a slightly different case because you do keep the sonnet, that you can see the sonnet on the page, so that's kind of immediately imposes the influence of the original text. But it's really varies. It really varies from author to author, and it's much more of an individual. I don't think there is really much of a rule in terms of who really speaks very closely to the end source and who really doesn't. But that's kind of my impression.
Okay, we've run out of time, but if anybody wants to continue this discussion and maybe add a bit of football equation, there's as part of Arts Week we have a panel of Adam Smythe, Joe Brooker and Dennis Duncan talking about literature and football in the College Arms around the corner. I think it starts at 6.
But yes, we'll be going for a drink in the College Arms now. Anyone is free to join us.
And can you all join me in thanking Kaja and Linda for 2 really great, interesting talks?